If you thought the campaign trail was cooling off, President Biden and former President Trump are heating it right back up again. President Biden hit the trail in Arlington, Virginia Friday night. Former President Trump attended a rally in Arizona on Saturday. Both are states that Mr. Biden won in 2020, but Republicans are pushing to flip them red. For more on this, I want to bring in Sean Sullivan now. He's a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for The Washington Post. Hey there, Sean. Let's start with former President Trump's Arizona rally. I want to play for our audience a clip where he calls out Republicans in name only, or rhinos, for failing to sufficiently support him.
Sadly, even in many red states, the rhinos are letting the radical left have their way on everything. You know that. In fact, I have to say this. In many cases, these weak Republicans, or rhinos, these weak Republicans are worse. They're worse than Democrats. And you have a couple of examples right here in Arizona. And don't nod and don't say it.
Sean, there were a lot of Republican gubernatorial hopefuls on the stage there. How important is a Trump endorsement for candidates in Arizona?
Well, Lana, in Arizona and in much of the country right now, that is really what a lot of these Republican primaries are boiling down to. You are seeing candidate after candidate in every state, in virtually every congressional district, every race, try to tether themselves to former President Trump, try to present themselves as the staunchest defenders of Trump. So these Republican primaries have effectively become, at least in the early stages of this cycle, as a test of which candidate can sort of prove that they are most loyal, most similar to the former president. And what we heard from former President Trump at this rally yesterday is a lot of the same stuff that we've been hearing from him in his post-presidency. I mean, a lot of his anger is directed not at Democrats, although a lot of it, a lot of what he talked about yesterday was directed at Democrats, but a lot of it is directed at Republicans seen as disloyal to him. And so that's a big emerging storyline right now as we move toward next year's midterms, is how is this all going to shake out for Republicans like Congresswoman Liz Cheney, Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republicans who have not been seen as Trump defenders, and who indeed Trump himself has said, look, these are not Republicans that I can support, and I'm going to try to defeat these Republicans. So we're really seeing the beginnings of a really, really intense civil war right now in the Republican Party. And I think what we saw in Arizona is sort of typical of what we're seeing in a lot of other states. A lot of candidates are trying to align themselves with Trump. A lot of candidates really want his endorsement in a Republican primary. The flip side of that, though, is there are some Republicans and many Democrats who believe that endorsement might come back to haunt these candidates in the general election, particularly in swing battleground areas where Trump is not really, really popular. So it's a bit of a balancing act going on right now. But no doubt these Republican primaries centering heavily on the former president. He remains very, very popular in his own party right now.
Fascinating if that's a barrier to entry in the primary and then becomes a task that they have to bear in the general. All right, let's talk about President Biden, because he hit the campaign trail Saturday for Virginia's governor, Terry McAuliffe, who's trying to win back his former job. You were there covering the president, who was pretty direct when critiquing his predecessor.
Terry and I share a lot in common. I ran against Donald Trump, and so is Terry. And I whipped Donald Trump in Virginia, and so will Terry.
So tell us what you made of that pointed criticism. Does it say anything to you about Democrats' broader messaging?
Yeah, it really says a lot. And this Virginia race is really going to be a test of their strategy. Right now, they have concluded in this race that the best way to make sure that their voters are energized, to make sure that their base is out there, to make sure that the gains that they made among suburban moderates stay in the Democratic category, is to bring up former President Trump. Speaker after speaker after speaker at that rally for former Governor Terry McAuliffe talked about Trump. They tied Glenn Youngkin, who is the Republican nominee who McAuliffe is running against, to Trump. And then we heard right there, President Biden, who I would point out has not really gone out of his way to try to pick fights with the former president. When we've seen White House officials asked about Trump, when we've seen them asked to comment on things that he said and done, and when President Biden has been asked, you'll often see them not try to stoke a direct fight. They'll redirect. They'll try to talk about their agenda. For the first few months of this presidency, they've sort of sent this message of, look, we want to turn the page. We want to start a new chapter. But in this campaign, it's very, very clear that as a political strategy, Democrats believe that one of the best things they can do is to bring up Trump and to tie Republican candidates to Trump. They believe that is the way to keep people energized. So Virginia is going to be the first big test of this, the big race this year that a lot of people are watching. It's a race right now that I think on both sides you have strategists acknowledging is a closer race than I think many people think, even though Virginia is a state that is trended more and more Democratic over the last few years. But this is going to be a big test. Can Democrats convince voters, suburban voters and their base, that these down ballot candidates who are supported by Trump, who have said things that are supportive of Trump, present the same or at least a similar threat to what Trump presented? If they're successful in doing that, then I think they will look to that blueprint over and over again in the midterm elections. If this doesn't work, if this falls flat, they might have to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what do we do right now? What will our strategy be moving forward? But it really was a striking show of what the Democratic playbook looks like. The fact that we saw President Biden blatantly and overtly talk about the former president and tie McAuliffe's opponent to him just shows you in clear terms what their strategy is there.
Well, fascinating that for both men, President Trump would continue to loom so large after leaving office. That's traditionally not how we see things. Let's turn the page and talk a little bit about the committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol, Sean. Just 2 days before they're scheduled to meet, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi added Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger just now. How is Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy responding to this?
Not well, and it's not surprising. We have seen the battle lines drawn here. We've saw prior to this, of course, that some of the Republicans that McCarthy put forward were rejected by Pelosi. And so I think right now you're seeing the Republicans try to portray what this committee does as a partisan exercise. But on the other side, I think when you look at Speaker Pelosi, she does want this committee to not be totally partisan. She does want it to have Republicans on it. So at the end of the day, she can go to the American people with whatever they end up finding in their and say, look, this was the product of a bipartisan investigation. It is worth pointing out that Kinzinger is somebody who has not been a supporter of Trump. In fact, he's been a vocal critic of Trump. So I would expect Republicans to point at that and say, look, this is not a committee staffed with Republicans that are friendly or even kind of middle of the road when it comes to the former president. So we're really seeing kind of more of the same, basically, a big partisan showdown between the two sides on Capitol Hill. And we'll see both what this committee finds and how the American people react. Will they look at this and say, okay, this is an authoritative investigation and the findings are something that we accept? Or are they going to have doubts about it? Those are also two questions, I think, that are going to loom large over the midterm elections next year.
All right. Sean Sullivan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.